What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance Crew, and you're watching DaVinci Reacts. Today's episode, we're going to be continuing our OverSimplified series. This is the Cold War Part 2. For those of you that kept asking me when's the next one coming out, you're welcome. As you guys know, we already tackled the first one, which I believe the timeline for the first one was between when Lenin first came into power all the way until Khrushchev. What did he do? I think it was just when they had the standoff at, what was it called? It was something Charlie. I forgot the name of it. But it was some type of exchange point in Berlin, Charlie. And they were, well, just watch the other video if you want to go ahead and understand where we left off last. This one's going to go ahead and continue on. I imagine this one is going to have the Cuban Missile Crisis, proxy wars, and of course the fall of the Soviet Union. But let's go ahead and jump into it.
This video was made possible by
Holy
Skillshare,
crap,
an online learning community where you can learn just about anything.
go.
Support my channel by signing up using the link below and get your first 2 months for free. For anyone who thinks recent US history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you the 1960s, extreme cultural division, major political assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government, which is exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a
It's crazy to think that people can just get together and decide, hey, let's take over a country, and it works. Like, how the hell? I would imagine he'd have to have a lot of connections and already have, like, an established backing behind him before he even thought about doing it. But I'm just wondering how somebody can just, like, take over I'm not planning on taking over a government or some shit. Don't put words in my mouth. I'm just wondering, how does it work? Like, how do you be like, oh, well, just send Lenin to Russia and he's going to take over the government? Like, it seems like it would require more than just sending somebody over there. I know there's more to it than just this. It's pretty simplified. Roll credits. But, yeah, it just seems like unrealistic.
Communist
Even though it
regime being
happened.
set up in its own backyard. So the US immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any US involvement in the plan. So he
took the
massively scaled
chopper.
back American air
Do it
support,
now.
and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. But Castro felt there was still an impending US threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida. Hey, I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just going to suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. Oh, no, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right. That's the cutest dog I've ever seen. Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles. America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast. They knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy came up with another idea, a blockade. The US Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba, and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviet put its military into full combat readiness. The US did the same, and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between the two sides broke down as Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed. And for the first time in history, US Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and two of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the third senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The US finalized its preparations, and
You know how much balls you have to do something like that? Because if, let's say that a nuclear war had just started, if he would have denied it, he could have easily put Russia in a position where they would have been completely ass out. Like, the United States would have already sent nuclear weapon or nuclear missiles to them, and they would have already been in a position where, like, they could have taken out a big portion of Russia before that nuclear weapon even had a chance to launch. But because he stuck with his intuition, was like, okay, well, I don't think it really happened. This might have been a mistake, and it turned out it was a mistake. Man, I hope that guy has a day named after him. I'm not sure if I have too many subscribers in Russia right now, but if I do, let me know if this person has a holiday or is remembered in any way at all.
Kid you not, the day before the US were set to decide the day and time for the Cuban invasion, Khrushchev was like, hey, you know if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba? Yeah, that sounds good to me. It was a bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the two sides finally came to an agreement. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba, and the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief. Except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end with one.
Who the hell is that person that was over on the grass?
A few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited
Is that something I should know?
treaty. Secondly, the Soviets ousted Khrushchev and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser. He liked to kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at the prospect of nuclear war, but still, the arms race raged on throughout the 60s and 70s. U.S. intelligence
leader now, he'd be a
Soviets'
victim of the
nuclear
Me Too
arsenal
movement.
was not as powerful as they
That
previously
didn't look consensual.
thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they would be completely destroyed by a nuclear war, neither would risk starting one.
And that's the
But
reason
even
we haven't
without
gone to war
the world was already feeling the effects of
almost
nuclear
ever.
weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a U.S. bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine. Whoa, boy. Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay. What were you gonna do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't. Are you breathing right now? Yeah, I wouldn't. It took the Americans 2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had gone missing in the ocean. This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950. Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight. After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East, Vietnam. Back in the 50s, the Vietnamese had kicked their French colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into two. In the north, a communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime. So the north established the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the south with Soviet support. The US sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more South Vietnamese to support the Viet Cong. And over the next decade, the situation escalated to a breaking point. America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India? LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops, and so in they went. From 1965, America found itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before. Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier. Did you see him? Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder. The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war, and I could never do it justice in this video. But in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many, many global conflicts that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. In the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed, and the US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua. These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin with, but superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming levels of human suffering.
You know what's funny about the proxy wars? It's like they were so extremely short-sighted that within a matter of like a decade, the very groups that, like the United States, for example, were fighting against the United States. It seems like you would want to do more a background check on the people that you plan on introducing into power. And it's probably never a good idea to support a dictator, because usually, they tend to not really stick very close to their word. So I don't understand why the United States were supporting so many dictators. I mean, wasn't there like a rebellious democratic group that was trying to take over the government? Like, I don't know. Did they take over governments? They were probably somewhere trying to vote or something. God damn it. Sometimes you just got to put down the damn ballot boxes and pick up a damn Beretta and just start taking shit out. I don't know if you could take over a country with Berettas.
Throughout the third world, and in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home.
Oh my God, look at that wallpaper.
Television. Going into the late 60s, America was a changing nation. This became
it's
this.
It's like fucking American
this
Bandstand in that
this.
living room.
And this became this. The new slogan that was taking root: make love, not war. The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War, and in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared to be increasingly unwinnable, and public opinion turning increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home, and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, the South fell. The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers.
It's interesting.
In Russia,
we're pretty cool with Vietnam
of the
now.
budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did they have to show for it? They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending in order to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as Détente. To improve relations, Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT Agreement that limited nuclear weapons.
Which just got overturned.
China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the U.S. table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However, internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed messages. Nixon even visited China in 1972, and it was a barrel of laughs.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China.
I know the Russians weren't necessarily sticking to their word.
To keep from hearing criticism.
Hold on a second. I'm going to go back and continue this whole clip. I know the Russians were not necessarily sticking to their word on SALT, but the fact that the agreement was set up, you could kind of use that against them, at least on from a diplomatic world setting. You can get more people to support you because these guys are outright not following the agreement that they said they would agree with. I didn't agree with the fact that we just destroyed the whole thing, because it kind of gives them a reason to start stockpiling nuclear weapons again. But then again, I think the United States just wanted to stockpile weapons also. That's probably why they did it. I don't know. There's more to it. I'll look into it later, but whatever.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
And assassins.
You put the stopper into his ears so that he couldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair of these.
You probably don't want those. You wouldn't hear the FBI coming from behind you.
Everything was going great for Nixon, until it was uncovered that back home he was being a very naughty boy and violating constitutional protocol. I'm announcing today my resignation as president, and I'm passing the office to my vice president, Gerald Ford. Wow, you mean in America that people can actually remove their leader when he breaks the law? Why not just rule by force? Where's the corruption? And my first act as president is to pardon Nixon. Ah, there it is. After the whole fiasco,
You have no
Americans
idea how
decided what
corrupt
they
we can
really
be.
wanted was just a nice, safe guy who wouldn't cheat on them. So they elected Jimmy Carter, and the two sides met in Vienna, where they signed yet another strategic arms limitation treaty. It's an honor, Premier Brezhnev. Likewise, President Carter. Please don't do that. But that's not to say there was no longer any tension between the two sides, because there was. Heaps of it. Once again, the Soviet Union put down further attempts at reform and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc. The Euro missile crisis saw new and improved classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979, the Soviets thought it would be a good idea if they had their own Vietnam and invaded Afghanistan to prevent a US-sponsored Islamic insurgency. And in response to these various crises, Olympic Games were boycotted. Conservatives were concerned that US policy had become too soft, and in 1980,
You
they
let him
decided
kiss
they
you.
wanted a president who would be tough on communism, so they elected Ronald Reagan. and Reagan came in guns blazing. Concerned at the Soviet Union's human rights violations, he made a speech calling them an evil empire, and he also wanted to renew the arms race using technological advances in computing and lasers. He came up with the Space Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which was basically a big defensive anti-nuke
I've heard Star
shield
Wars
around
was
the
actually
country, but
fake.
a lot of people
Is that
thought
true?
it was a pretty dumb idea. The Soviet Union perceived this shift in rhetoric
I
as
can
the
look it up,
USA
of course,
getting
but
ready for war,
it'd
and
be
they were
faster
feeling
if you just told
especially
me.
threatened as their relationship with their communist ally China had broken down. Relations took a big hit in 1983 when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner that had strayed into their airspace, and it looked like the world was going right back to mid-20th century Cold War tension. But then Brezhnev got really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and he was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev. Coming into office in 1985, he was the real game changer. His philosophy differed a lot from previous Soviet leaders. He felt that the reason the Soviet system and economy was struggling was that it didn't allow the Soviet people to find satisfaction in their work, because they weren't allowed to speak freely and lived in fear. Gorbachev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but unlike previous Soviet leaders, he actually made the change happen. Within the first couple of years, he began the political movement for more openness and transparency, and the restructuring of the Soviet political and economic systems. And change very quickly took effect. People could criticize the government, they could enjoy Western pop culture, the media interviewed Margaret Thatcher, but most importantly, the Soviet people could now enjoy Pizza Hut. All hail to Gorbachev. He also knew that
Yay,
the arms
Pizza
race
Hut ended
needed to
Cold
end
War.
in order to rescue the Soviet economy, and a positive relationship with the West must be established. Constructive dialogue reopened and resulted in the INF Treaty, which saw all intermediate-range missiles eliminated, which was huge. Reagan's tone towards the Soviet Union began to soften, and things were looking up.
I
But
take
what
that
were
back.
these
That
reforms
was
mean
the,
for the Eastern Bloc? For decades,
legislation that
the
was
Soviets had
overturned
been
recently,
brutally
not salt.
suppressing any attempt at change. Now, would they be allowed? And that was the exact question on Hungary's lips when the Prime Minister visited Moscow. Gorbachev's response: he didn't necessarily agree with the reforms, but he wouldn't stop them either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its own future. This was massive, and the Hungarian leaders began planning free, multi-party elections. Poland followed suit and also held elections in June. The anti-Soviet party Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. But not just that. In Hungary, the barbed wire border between East and West was removed. The Iron Curtain was unraveling. But not all Eastern Bloc leaders were happy. Notably, East Germany was still ruled by a hardline Stalinist, Erich Honecker, and many East Germans were still eager to get out. They had been trapped by the Berlin Wall, but now they were doing the math. If they could travel to Hungary, and Hungary's border with the West was loosening, could they now make it to the West? That summer, East Germans decided Hungary was the latest top holiday destination. They traveled there in droves, and using various methods, tens of thousands crossed the border into Austria and the West. Honecker was furious, and blocked travel to Hungary, but that civil liberties train had
Did he just
started
karate
rolling,
kick him?
and it wasn't stopped. Thousands more flocked to the West German embassy in Prague, where they stormed the fence around the embassy gardens, and a temporary refugee camp was set up. In September, deals were struck to allow the refugees to travel west via train. Back in East Germany, the people were running on a civil liberties high, and they wanted their next hit. Dissent was growing. Over time, demonstrations turned to mass protest, with plainclothes secret police officers doing their best to put down the dissent, but it had grown well out of their control. And worse, the biggest demonstration was yet to come. We're gonna put all of this down by force, right guys? Guys? Unfortunately, everyone had realized what he had not. This was bigger than them, and the entire East German Politburo voted him out of power. On November 4th, over 500,000 East Germans took to the streets of East Berlin. For many, there was still one big target left in their sights: that damn wall. The pressure on the East German government was too great, and on November 9th, they made a bit of a chaotic announcement that the travel ban between East and West was being lifted. The change wasn't meant to take effect until the next day, and crossing guards still had orders to shoot on sight any who tried to cross. But that night, huge crowds gathered at the crossing points, and the guards were overwhelmed. In an astronomically historic moment, after decades of family separation and travel restriction, the people were allowed to pass through. East and West Berliners couldn't believe it, and celebrated
beautiful.
together throughout the night. Some even climbed the wall and began to topple it. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and a year later, Germany would be reunited. Elections in Bulgaria, a peaceful revolution in Czechoslovakia, and a violent one in Romania brought to an end communist authority in the Eastern Bloc. America decided it would be best if it just stayed away and let the change happen, as the anti-communist movement continued all the way back to Moscow. Gorbachev had given the people the freedom to demonstrate. Now, they demonstrated for an end to the communist single.
Just a quick note. It's almost funny how, well, let me make sure I got my time right. It's almost funny how when you think about, well, not necessarily funny, but when you think about it, Germany hasn't really been a country in and of itself for a very long, for a long time. And I'm not talking about like before when it was the Holy Roman Empire and stuff like that. I'm talking about when it was actually Germany, like the country that we know now. It hasn't been together for a very long time. Like the German Empire was around for, was it 100 years, something like that, before it eventually broke apart again, and then turned into the Germany that eventually led to the Nazis, and then it was split up again. Like how long has Germany actually been a solid country without being split or anything like that? Because based on what I've read, which I could be wrong, maybe I was looking at the wrong sources, but Germany has probably been together as a country less time than the United States has. And the United States is a relatively new country as far as countries are concerned. I know there are countries that are way younger, but 200 plus years is still a small amount of time for a country.
Party rule, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time in history, elections were held in which candidates not officially endorsed by the party were allowed to run. Ambitious rival of Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, led a growing democratic movement. Now things here get quite confusing, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a complicated topic. So believe me, this is oversimplified, but it went a little bit like this. The Soviet Union was made up of a number of smaller Soviet republics, the largest of which was Russia. Yeltsin got himself elected the president of Russia, and began a struggle for sovereignty against Gorbachev and the greater Soviet Union. Communist hardliners were horrified at what Gorbachev was allowing, so they briefly kidnapped him and tried to set up their own emergency government. But Yeltsin and his supporters all gathered around the White House in Moscow and were like, no, we have a tank. So the hardliners had to concede and released Gorbachev. Wow, thanks Boris. That was a close one. No problem. And thanks to you for all the great freedom you've given us. Anytime, pal. And just to inform you, I've used that freedom you've given us to go behind your back and make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up the Russian Federation. In other words, you're no longer in charge. I am. Dude. So uncool. And so decades of tension and the everlasting threat of nuclear war finally came to an end as democratic governments were established in many of the old Soviet republics, and the world got along together forever after. Right, guys? Hey, this modern art thing is growing on me.
World War III coming soon.
Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with classes in design, technology, business, and more. Learn how to code your own games and apps.
Well, I have a
Learn
quick
musical
question.
Instrument. Learn how to animate
While this is
videos like
playing.
mine. Learn Japanese. Premium membership
What
gives
do you think
unlimited access to all of these classes
World War
and
III,
more. And better yet, everything is taught
if
by
it does
genuine
happen,
experts working in their field.
do you
Skillshare is
think
also
that
more
it's going to be
affordable
a
than other
war
learning
that
platforms,
involves
with
nuclear
an annual
weapons?
subscription being
Because I
less
know a
than
lot of people
$10
say
a
World
month.
War III is the end of
What's
the
that?
world, but
You wish you had an
is it?
exclusive deal just for OverSimplified viewers? Well, wish no more. my friend.
Personally, I
The
don't
first
think
500
that countries
people to use
are
this
foolish
link,
enough
which can
to
be
just
found in
flat
the
out
description
destroy
below, will get
themselves
the
over
first
a
2
war.
months for
Like you
absolutely
still,
free.
it
Plus, you'll be
doesn't really
supporting
serve
my
any
channel and
like
keeping these
point
videos coming.
purpose
So be
to
sure
do
to
that.
use the link in the
I
description
think that
box
if World
below
War
and
III
learn
did
something
happen,
new today.
I don't think nuclear weapons would be used personally. It depends on what country it is. If this country with a crazy ass leader like North Korea or something, then I can see them trying to use a nuclear weapon. But I don't think that the United States or Russia would try to use nuclear weapons on each other because they know that it would just kill them. Like there's no way you're gonna be able to shut down every single nuclear weapon in a country unless like you're able to take out their power grid, which in of itself is again extremely difficult and hard to do. Because even if the power did go out, I'm pretty sure some of the places that operate nuclear weapons run on backup generators and stuff. So, like, what exactly would cutting the power out do? You would just give them enough time to launch nuclear weapons back at you, and that would just take you out. Now, yeah, if World War III did happen, I don't think that it would necessarily lead to the end of the world. I don't think that the people within the country would just flat out be 100% in favor of a war that could destroy themselves. I think that it would I think that people would do what people would do in that situation. Like if it starts to get too crazy, they would just like start a revolution or take over the government or take matters into their own hands. Something like that. I think that I said I think a lot, I know. But the idea that people would just be all in favor of just destroying themselves, I think is a ridiculous notion to make. But that's just my opinion about it. Of course, there's no telling what the hell would happen if a war like that ever happened or broke out. I think borders would change. I don't think countries would just flat out disappear. except for maybe North Korea. But yeah, I think borders will probably change. I think that governments would change. So countries that were communist may change. Countries that weren't communist may change. Pretty much stuff like that. Like it would be kind of weird. Not to mention the fact that World War III could take place through the cyber world. World War III could be just a bunch of cyber attacks on each other, because cyber warfare is technically still war. So if the world was, doing cyber attacks against each other, wouldn't that technically make it a world war? And since we've already had two, wouldn't that technically make it World War III? Maybe. But anyway, that's my opinion. I want to thank you guys for coming through. If you like this video, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and share. I have some more videos I want to check out. Maybe I'll get into the smaller oversimplified videos. But as of this point, I haven't necessarily decided. But you never know what the future holds. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you guys in my next video. I'm Devon DaVinci, and you've just been enlightened. I'm giving you the deuces, and I'll see you there. Deuces.